Witches, banners, kings and queens, factories and big machines, castles, forts and in-betweens are stories that are told. Folklore is a rich part of our cultural heritage. Back in the old days, when people used to gather together in an evening and share stories, they would build up a rich tapestry of stories and legends, drawing on local history and geography, which would make them completely unique from everyone else. And I want to explore some of Yorkshire's original and unique folklore. We're going to start first with St. Hilda of Whitby. Now, St. Hilda was instrumental in the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity, and she helped found the monastery at Whitby Abbey. Now, if you've ever been to Whitby, perhaps you've strolled along the beach or gone to one of the souvenir shops, you might have noticed these things. They're called Ammonites, and we know these to be the fossilised remains of ancient sea creatures. But to people living hundreds of years ago, they were actually the remains of serpents turned to stone by St. Hilda. Now, as the story goes, when she first arrived in Whitby, the area was infested with poisonous snakes, so she prayed that they'd turn to stone, then drove them off the cliff where they curled up and turned to stone. This is why, when seagulls and other seabirds fly over Whitby Abbey, they dip their wings in respect. Now, this story is obviously very similar to the story of St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland, and it goes to show how, even though different cultures were influencing each other, each adapted their story to suit the features of their local land. The next poem is about Cadman, who was a monk at Whitby Abbey during the time of St. Hilda. Cadman is the earliest known English poet that we know of, and his poem is one of the oldest poems in Old English. Now, we actually know his story from the Venerable Bede, who was the first ever English historian. He wrote the book, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Now, the great thing about Bede is, like most writers of his time, he combined myth with historical fact. So although he does have tremendous value as a historian, generally we take what he writes with a pinch of salt because he mixed things with folklore. Cadman, as the story goes, was just a lowly cowherd who worked in Whitby Abbey, and on an evening when all the monks would sing and feast, he would get sad because he didn't know any songs. And one night, after getting very sad about the fact that he didn't know any songs, he decided to go to bed in the barn with his animals. But then that night he had a vision in a dream of a man telling him to compose a song about the creation of heaven and earth. And he initially refused, but then eventually he agreed, and he composed this beautiful poem. The next morning he told people, and then he was taken to see Hilda. She was very impressed, and then she gave him a challenge. He had to write another religious poem. The next day he wrote it, and she was very impressed, and he was invited to take monastic vows. He did, and then went on to create some of the most beautiful Christian verse. And that's the story, and eventually he dies peacefully. So it's all fairly a good story. Caedmon's poem or hymn does exist, and historians agree that he was a real person who was a monk at Whitby Abbey who wrote a lot of hymns and poems. But it goes to show how a lot of our stories are based on real historical people, but then have the details extrapolated on afterwards. Now, this next story doesn't have any relation to Whitby or Hilda or Caedmon, but it is still very interesting for a reason I'll get to shortly. It was first recorded by William of Newburgh, who was a 12th century historian from Bridlington and a monk. Now, he tells a story of Willy Howe, which was a barrow in East Yorkshire. It's rather unremarkable, there's nothing inside it. But what is interesting, it's got at least 3 stories connected to it about fairies. Now, fairies are fascinating. They crop up all over mythology and folklore in the British Isles, and they date back to Celtic times. Now, as the story goes, a man was travelling alone at night past the barrow when he heard the sounds of feasting and merriment coming from within. So he went to investigate, and the fairy folk offered him a drink. And the thing is, you never accept any food or drink which the fairies give you. So he poured out the contents, took the cup, and went on his way. Well, eventually, the cup managed to find its way into the hands of King Henry I of England and King David I of Scotland, who, if you are perceptive, you might remember from my video about the Battle of the Standard. And when I found that story, I was thinking, wow, that's interesting. Now, we aren't quite sure of the origin of that story or why perhaps a fairy cup would end up in the hands of King Henry I, but it's such a fascinating example of how these local legends just weave history and real people into their entertaining stories. These are just a few of the folk tales from Yorkshire, and there's going to be so many more that I'm going to be sharing with you, so I hope you found these ones interesting.